I want to do that.
Good morning, welcome. My name is Andrew Fremberg. I'm the president of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. I'm thrilled to welcome you here this morning for our presentation. I'm also thrilled to welcome those of you that have joined us physically here in our museum, which just opened last week. So thank you. I am thrilled to welcome Maria Juczewska, a former Victims of Communism Fellow, to come and present her fantastic recently published monograph on Captain Pilecki. And to introduce her will be Milda Boyce, the director of our Fellows Program. And I wanted to again thank you all for joining us, also joining us online. And we hope you enjoy this presentation. Milda.
Thank you, Ambassador Bromberg. And thank you for the audience, virtual and in person, joining today. And thank you, Maria, for braving the skies and coming through all the unanticipated itineraries to get here. So Maria was our 2018-2019 Research Fellow in Polish Studies program. And she's also a graduate in Statecraft and International Affairs at the Institute of World Politics in Washington, D.C. As her primary focus of her fellowship program, Maria chose to tell the story of the Captain Witold Pilecki and design structured lesson plans to educate middle and high school students about the manipulative and brutal nature of the Soviet communist totalitarian regime. In her monograph, Maria paints a full picture of Captain Pilecki's life, presenting it in a wider geopolitical, historical, and philosophical context. In this way, it helps offer to American audience a model allowing to understand how totalitarian regimes operate, denigrating human dignity and individual opposition to evil. The monograph highlights the similarities between Nazism and communism, which is an insightful point given that communist ideas, ideals, and social designs are concerningly supported by a considerable percentage of young Americans today. The Polish Studies program, to describe it in greater detail, was established in partnership with the Polish National Foundation, and the program consists of residential research fellowships to support publications and events aimed at understanding the 20th and 21st century history of Poland to help tell the story of freedom suppression by the forces of Nazism and communism and eventual rebirth of freedom. Understanding how these two totalitarian systems oppressed the Polish people and how free government was reestablished in their wake is critical to ensure and better prepare that our present and future endeavors will be focused on defending liberty against the ideas and forces of tyranny. And Maria's work is a really timely effort in this direction. Just a few housekeeping rules before I give the floor to Maria. The event is live streamed, so if you're sitting right next to the camera, please try to be quiet. And Maria's presentation will last about 20 to 30 minutes, followed by Q&A. I will moderate the questions and answers session. And if you have a question, please raise your hand, stand up, and keep your questions brief, introduce yourself. Maria will repeat the question, but please try to speak up as well. We have some refreshments in the back and a few copies printed of Maria's monograph. And I hope you enjoy this event. Maria, the floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to welcome you here today at the presentation devoted to Captain Witold Pilecki, the unsung hero of World War II intelligence. Individual opposition to evil is a very important feature of character that allows to face totalitarian systems, both Nazism and communism. And the wish to destroy this individual will to oppose is one of the characteristic features of Soviet communism. The new Soviet man was supposed to be the man devoid of individual values, individual Western values, and national identity. It was supposed to be the man pliable and obedient to the orders of the Communist Party. The obedience was to be forcibly, The obedience was to be forcibly instilled in Soviet men, and those who didn't want to yield to the Sovietizing pressure were to be exterminated. Usually those who opposed were extraordinary individuals, so the extermination of national elites became a trademark of communism all over the world. Who could be a better example to analyze, to initiate the Polish program at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, better than Captain Pilecki, an extraordinary individual who definitely in his life witnessed to how important it is to oppose individually the evils of totalitarianism. The characteristic feature which made him an interesting topic for me to propose to the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation was his unique experience of opposition towards both Nazism and communism. Although in popular culture in Poland, he features mostly as the volunteer for Auschwitz, the author of the first reports about the atrocities that were taking place in the Nazi German extermination camp, his contribution to proving how disastrous a totalitarian system can be did not end in Auschwitz. His later life and his efforts to inform the West about what the Sovietization process was all about are the last chapter of his life, which is often overlooked by authors, but nevertheless important to understand the whole life of Captain Pilecki. His life is also a timely reminder that certain rules that guide communism never change. What you can see here in the picture is the picture made in the city of Bucha when the Russian forces retreated, which showed to the world that civilians were targeted in all those places where the special military operation was taking place. It is a reminder of the methods that were used against the Polish underground in the years after the Iron Curtain fell over Poland and nobody knew or could find out what was happening to the Polish populace in the Stalinist Poland. Therefore, it is very important for the American audience to understand that certain rules that communism is applying when overtaking power in a country are universal, and no matter where you apply them, they end up in the same, in mass murder. Be it Cuba, be it China, be it Soviet Russia, or be it all the Soviet satellite countries of the Soviet Union, one of which was Poland. Oh no, my presentation is blocked. We need some technical assistance here. Thank you. What is very important to point out in this context of denigration of human individuality was that Captain Pilecki was virtually unknown in Poland during the times of communism. Nobody knew about the person who volunteered to infiltrate Auschwitz to gather reports about what was happening there and to dispatch them to the West. The first mention about him appeared in the 1970s in a newspaper article because the censorship lessened as a result of certain evolution of the communist regime. Nevertheless, until the 1990s, the life of Witold Pilecki was virtually unknown to wider audience in Poland. In the West, he was discovered by Józef Galiński, whose PhD was a discussion of Pilecki report, the document which Pilecki wrote after he successfully escaped Auschwitz, in which he detailed all the nightmares that he witnessed. This is an intelligence report which was destined for decision makers, but his unique feature is Witold's input, his reflections on how an individual is facing the extreme situations and how an individual is using his moral compass in the most difficult conditions to preserve dignity, life, and to be able to function even under the most extreme conditions. This document has been made available online at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation site. And if anybody is interested in the text of the original report, it is also available, just as the text of the monograph, which places the report in some cultural and historic context, which is very important to understand the person of Captain Pilecki and his achievements. In one of the books that are available in English about Witold Pilecki and what he did, there appeared a remark, how come a man like you and me, an everyday man, was able to volunteer for Auschwitz and perform all those acts of heroic bravery? What is important to understand for the American audience is that he was not an ordinary man. Witold Pilecki was the representative of the Polish elites of the interwar period. Those were people formed in the period of partitions when Poland had no existence as a state. It only continued as an idea between the representatives of the Polish nation who lived under three partitions, the Russian, the German, and the Austrian one. So we have to understand that he is the son of his generation of children in whom the patriotic Polish values were inculcated by their mothers and fathers, and who had to face the pressure of Russianization and Germanization, and who used their knowledge and acculturation as a force to rebuild Poland after the First World War. Witold Pilecki in his 30s was not only a landowner trying to restore into greatness the manor of his family, but also an innovator, a community organizer, a person who started a dairy cooperative for the local peasants, the local firefighters brigade, as well as the mounted militia, which he was financing on his own, even though his financial means were not considerable. He was also a doting father who remained a model of behavior for both his son and daughter, although the time he spent on being their father was relatively short, because the life of his family was dramatically changed by war. He was also, already before the war, an operative of Polish intelligence, although we don't have much information about this part of his life. We may make some theories and suppositions, but what it all boils down to is a brief mention by Pilecki, who was extremely humble man, in one of the CVs that was found in the archive, in which all the documents relating to the Polish Home Army soldiers in the West are gathered, in which he wrote that after all his achievements throughout the war, he was promoted to the rank of the captain, the rank that he already had before the war, although for the reasons of secrecy, he had to join the war as a lieutenant. So here we come to the secret Polish army and how come that there was Auschwitz at all in Poland, and how come Witold Pilecki become one of the first person to infiltrate the camp. And I don't want to get into a historical lecture here because it's beyond the gist of this presentation. All I want to remind is that on September 1, 1939, the Germans attacked Poland, and on September 17th, the Russians attacked Poland, who was already fighting the Germans. So on September 17th, it became quite clear to most of the fighting Polish soldiers that they had no chances to win the war. So as a result, Poland was partitioned into two occupation zones: the German occupation zone, which was partly joined with the Third Reich, and the general government, which remained a part of some sorts of a stump state, which was in which the Polish population was supposed to live, and to the Soviet zone of influence, which later became Western Belarusia and Western Ukraine, as a result of the plebiscites organized by the Soviets among the populace of those regions. In those conditions, Pilecki, whose family and whose manor was on the Russian side, on the Soviet side of this arrangement, was unable to come back home and check out on his family. So what he decided to do was to head for Warsaw and start underground activity there. And what needs to be also mentioned here is that those Polish soldiers who did not evacuate abroad and didn't fight in the West as one of the Allied armies, as one of the Allied forces, because Polish armed forces were a considerable side fighting on the side of the Allies. Those who did not make it outside of the occupied Poland went underground, and in the period at the end of 1939, there were very many underground outfits being formed by the former Polish soldiers who considered themselves still on duty. So what we have to understand about Pilecki and his position is that throughout the war, he continues the war effort in the occupied Poland and also later outside of Poland as a person who is in the army. He's still a soldier, he sees himself as a soldier, and in spite of the apparent disaster and complete clash of the Polish state, the Poles wanted to fight and they continued to fight underground. So one of those outfits was named Secret Polish Army, Tajna Armia Polska. This is the one that was joined by Pilecki and partly formed by Pilecki, who was very successful at enlarging it with the same method that he later applied in Auschwitz. Namely, he was recruiting one person who was supposed to recruit further persons, out of whom everyone had the duty to recruit further persons. In this way, he was able to geometrically increase the size of the organization that he was forming. How come he became a volunteer for Auschwitz? In spite of what the general populace tends to believe, it was not his own idea. It was the idea of his boss, who wanted to, my personal opinion is that his boss wanted to have a strong position when entering the negotiations with other outfits which were in the process of unification at that point. So he wanted to come out as a strong player in that game, and he wanted to make a meaningful contribution to whatever the Polish Home Army could do in Poland and offer to the Allies. So he volunteered one of his soldiers, Witold Pilecki, to Auschwitz, to go to Auschwitz and gather intelligence about the camp there. And although initially Pilecki was not delighted with this idea and he contemplated it for a while, he finally decided that this is the thing he is supposed to do and this is the way to go. And he joined, he allowed himself to be arrested by the Germans. the arrest took place in the Second Warsaw Roundup, which was taking place in Żoliborz district. It was a district of Warsaw inhabited mostly by Polish intelligentsia, and the Germans were just going from flat to flat and looking for the men and arresting them. And although Pilecki was offered the opportunity to flee by two members of the secret organizations he had formed and who lived in that building and knew the ways out of the building, he declined. And upon being taken away, he whispered to the person who lived in that flat and was his connection with other members of the secret organization for which he served, that he has fulfilled the order. So the information behind that short whisper was that he is going to do the research in Auschwitz and see what it's all about. And upon arrival at the camp on September 22, 1940, he realized that what he's witnessing it is an outlandish reality. Because the ride to the camp was already terrible. They were transported with inside an animal carriage in hailing lime, which was transported in that carriage earlier and not clean. They didn't have anything to drink or anything to eat. And upon disembarking from the train, they were surrounded by SS brigade with dogs, and they were marched to the camp. And upon the entrance to the camp, they listened to a speech which informed them that this is a Vernichtungslager. Vernichtungslager means this is an annihilation camp. So there was no beating about the bush that this is a work camp, that there is any other purpose of this activity than the extermination of the inmates. He got a relatively low number, 4,959, and he assumed an identity because his reasoning was that if intelligentsia is targeted, probably military people are targeted too. So he was not revealing that he was a soldier, which was a correct assumption as his experience proved. He quickly realized that before he starts any underground work, he must first of all focus on surviving. And those two tasks, surviving and work, to build his intelligence organizations, are clearly delineated in his report. And this is very interesting to read the report and see his insights when he is writing that the atrocities he witnessed, the practices whose sole aim was only the destruction of the human health of all the inmates and their quick death, in him evoked the sense of revolt, and it spiked his will to survive. When seeing this planned annihilation of his own nation, because at that point Auschwitz served as a camp primarily destined for the extermination of Polish intelligentsia and Poles in general, and it remained so for the first 2 years of the activity of the camp. He felt the need and the urge to work and to survive. So with time, he devised a way how to avoid complete physical exhaustion by finding a work in a work unit which was working under the roof. Finding a work under the roof was a critical condition of surviving in the camp, because like this, the winter of 1939-1940 was a terrible winter with very low temperatures, and those who worked outside didn't last longer than 2 weeks. So he was able to organize for himself a work under the roof, and as soon as he had it, he was able to start his organization and recruiting the first members who were then supposed to recruit further. And what we can read in his report was that as soon as a certain time passed and the first reports were dispatched outside of the camps, And it started to be known to the Allies what the real purpose of the camp is. And this information started to trickle down to the general audience. The conditions in Auschwitz started to improve. And Pilecki, who was making it very specific that the conditions of the Vernichtungslager, which he entered in 1939, at the end of the 1939, were completely different in comparison to the same camp 3 years later, which, even though it was still a killing machine, in the daily routines and the daily way of life of the inmates improved. And he believed that it improved because the Germans knew that if they lose the war, everybody will know what was happening in the camps because they knew it even before the war. So even if some of the authors writing about Pilecki said that ultimately he failed in his mission of organizing an uprising in the camp and of liberating the inmates, which was his ultimate wish and ultimate aim. Nevertheless, he succeeded in making the information public and in making it far less lethal than it could have been if nobody infiltrated the camp and nobody let the world know what was happening. Of course, you may wonder how he organized the reporting. Initially, the reports were dispatched with the people who were liberated from the camp through bribery, because it was still possible at the very beginning to buy out the arrested from the camps. However, the Germans soon stopped doing this because the conditions in the camp were so horrible that they didn't want anybody to spill the beans. So they stopped letting people out, but nevertheless, the moment they stopped punishing people for escapes with death, Pilecki started to be in favor of escapes, because as long as the escapes of the inmates were being punished with decimation of other inmates, he was against escaping. And his organization, when it was supporting inmates in the attempts to survive, was not trying to organize escapes. But the moment the conditions in the camp in this regard were less severe and the punishment of death was no longer meted out to those who remained, Pilecki was in favor of escapes, and finally he escaped himself. Why did he do it? He did it because he had a crawling suspicion that the reports of his were not getting to the correct unit of the underground organization, so to say. Because his idea for the organization of the opposition inside of the camp was to get organized so that an armed uprising can be prepared and performed by the inmates. So ultimately, in his way of thinking, he is all the time an intelligence officer working for a precise military aim, so to say. And his calls to action, his calls to mobilization and his calls for support from the outside, because of course those people who were liberated, they had to have some support from the outside that would help them hide and survive after liberation, met with silence. So in order to ensure that his reports reach the correct destination and then that this inmate uprising can be organized, he decided to flee. And you can read about how he escaped in his report, which is in itself a very interesting story. What I want to point out here is that he, to prepare the escape, he had to change a commando in which he worked, just as two of the friends that accompanied him in escape. And this is a characteristic feature of Witold Pilecki, that he ensured that if his other two friends are caught, there will be a justification for them to change the Arbeitskommando, and on paper it will look correct. They will always be able to say that, oh no, they were not planning on escaping. But for him, the change of the Arbeitskommando required so many manipulations that it would be impossible to hide that he was planning something. So even in preparing his escape, he is heroic in this way that he devises a plan in which there is a way out for his friends. But for him, this was a very big risk of getting killed. Nevertheless, he succeeded, and he managed to provide his reports to the Polish Home Army deciding authorities, but his plan of uprising was rejected due to the objective conditions, namely the Polish authorities of the underground believe that nobody is going to help the inmates even if they escape, because the Polish populace in the area was being terrorized by the Germans, and Poland couldn't count on the help of the Allies in this regard, even through targeted bombing or other kind of support that could be delivered by air. So ultimately they decided against it. So what does Witold do after leaving Auschwitz? Is he coming back to his family and enjoying the life as much as you can enjoy it under German occupation? No, he continues his work in an underground outfit, and he has chosen to start a new organization, which was called Independence. NIE for short with Polish, because it's the first three letters of the word, and also it means no in Polish. And this organization was being prepared as a backup, because the political situation in the meantime deteriorated. It started to become quite clear that Poland, after the Second World War, may become a communist country or in the communist sphere of influence. And the Polish underground wanted to ensure that there is some structure that is going to inform on what is going on, and that is going to organize opposition. So this was the outfit for which Pilecki was working. However, Warsaw Uprising happened in 1944, calling all the men alive in Warsaw who served in the Home Army and other military underground outfits for the open uprising against the retreating Germans. And the uprising was taking place between August 1, 1944 and October 3. It was the largest manifestation of opposition against the German terror in Europe, against the largest uprising during the Second World War. Ultimately, it failed. It decimated whatever was left of the old Polish elites and new Polish elites, because people serving in the uprising were as young as 12 years old. And this was the way in which Pilecki found himself in a POW camp. And ultimately, he was located in Murnau POW camp and then liberated by the Allied forces. And there, from Germany, he traveled to Italy, where the Second Polish Corps was stationed. And there he faced a decision, whether he is going back to Poland or whether he remains in the West, as many members of the Polish armed forces did after the war. And again, I don't want to descend into a historic lecture at this point, because this was not my main interest, but just to paint briefly the situation for you. The Yalta Agreement in the 1945 40s, right after the war, was not understood widely as a division of the world into the Soviet and the Western influence zone. Officially, Stalin promised that he will not be forcing the populace of the later satellite countries to yield to communism. It was to be decided by the population, and it was an old trick he has already used. He wanted to legitimize the communist power in his part of the world, so he thought about falsifying the elections and falsifying the popular plebiscites just to say, listen, here it is, this is my legitimation for the overtake of power. The people who are in the Soviet sphere of influence want to be in the Soviet sphere of influence. So the reason why Pilecki went to Poland was he believed that the war is not over, that his duties to which he was sworn in as an intelligence officer earlier still apply. He made a specific decision to vow again to perform his duties in a correct and valiant manner. And so he did in the camp and was in the place where the Second Polish Corps in Italy lived, and he was dispatched to Poland. And he returned to Poland on an intelligence mission. And this was the beginning of the end. I'm sorry. And here also begins this part of my research, which actually proves that the experience of Witold Pilecki under communism is very much alike his experience under Nazism. The only difference is this, that now he is not in a concentration camp. Now the concentration camp comes to him because the whole new administrative structure of Poland is infused with Soviet influence. And an infamous Ministry of Public Security is created. And this is a military, how to put it? This is a state administration outfit in which public functions are performed by military officers, military functionaries, whose aim is to subjugate a certain part of the populace and introduce terror. So this is the public security they mean. And curiously enough, in every communist country, you have a corresponding structure, a corresponding organization. This is like a trademark of communism, that even though it is all about the unity of the working people, nevertheless, you still have to have some public security outfit that is used to terrorize the working people and all other people into submission. And this is what happened to Pilecki. But before it happened, he tried to continue his intelligence mission. But he quickly realized it is completely impossible to conduct it in the manner he did it under the wartime conditions. First of all, because the old methods of operation of the Polish underground were known to the Soviets, because they were present in Poland before the war and they infiltrated the milieu of Polish Whole Army pretty well. So they knew the methods. He had to rely on so Pilecki in his intelligence work had to rely on a much less formal structure. There was no formal vow. There was often no information that any kind of information collection was going on. And in fact, I'm not sure how many people knew that he was reporting on the information that he collected somewhere farther. A few knew, but many who worked with him didn't know. That's why he had a sense of dishonesty, so to say, when he was arrested. When we assume, when we sum up what he was doing for more or less a year between his return to Poland and arrest, we may say he was conducting the so-called open source intelligence. He was just collecting information about what was going on in different institutions of the new Soviet state, analyzing it, and his conclusions and the conclusions of other people who cooperated with him, a few others who analyzed it with him, were dispatched through a courier to the West. So he was not fishing out secret documents and dispatching them to the West, the way we understand espionage. He was doing sort of an intellectual analysis of the surrounding circumstances. And that's why he vehemently denied any accusation of espionage later on, because he was not spying. He was just thinking what this is all is about. Nevertheless, the traces of the organization that was dispatching information outside of the Polish border were found by the encroaching security services, who used this is completely unknown to the wider American audience, but between 1937 and 1953, there was an organized effort in Poland of the communist secret services to weed out every former soldier of the Home Army. And the aim was to force into obedience those who were pliable enough and to exterminate everybody else. This was a real terror in Poland. We really have to understand, coming back to the picture from Ukraine that I analyzed at the very beginning, that this is a modus operandi of the communist system. And even though Russia is no longer communist, the same methods apply. And they apply in Poland. And unfortunately, to the misfortune of Pilecki, he fell prey to those methods. What I want to point out here as well is the clash of cultures, which is very important. What you can see here is the picture of Colonel Różalski, who was known all over Warsaw for his terrible methods of operation. He was a sadist, and he organized for himself a team of other sadistic investigators, and they were widely known for it. So he was not an exception from the rule. This was, again, the method. And this man could, for instance, in the course of investigation, inform the tortured prisoner that he killed off his family members. There is one witness of a tortured victim that the team of Różalski informed him that his wife was murdered, which was so paradoxical because the wife of the victim was actually a person who was this communist ideal of social advancement. This was a girl from a farming family from the countryside who worked so hard that she became a university professor. And she was abducted from the street there, and her naked body was found somewhere in the forest. And she was a mother of the family on top of that. So Różalski was the man who was using such methods to find out the details of whatever underground resistance outfit was being formed in Poland. And he was the man who was investigating Pilecki. So they had no chance. Pilecki had no chance. Nevertheless, before the whole torture began in the investigation, Pilecki thought that he would be able to reason with his investigator and to explain the reasons for his activity. And he wrote a poem, because one of the many features of Witold Pilecki was also the artistic inclinations. He was a painter and also he was writing poetry. So he described what he felt as an arrested, and he described his activity in this poem. And he writes, "Although my skin was unblemished, my soul has been eaten by leprosy, but leaving the body alone, meaning nobody knew what he was doing. Walking the streets, I carried the plague within me, unbeknownst to a friend who insisted on me joining him and his wife for an afternoon tea. He endangered himself with his whole family." So he says that whoever he visited was in danger because of what Pilecki was doing. "So I sat there, a cup in my hand, avoiding their eyes, when asked about my profession, mentioning writing, painting, or sculpting as my occupation. So nobody knew. He was fishing for information. He was not really doing a traditional style intelligence network with people sworn in and asked to do further efforts. It was enough for me to enter, to spread a germ to their home, seemingly non-existent, the dark token of my gratitude. In exchange for the food shared so gladly, I could break their lives, send them to a dungeon," which is precisely what happened. "One of my friends opened to me his whole heart because I met him in hell and helped him survive in spite of perditions there sparing not human life." So he's describing the friendship that was began between him and another of his collaborators who also had the experience of a concentration camp. "But by devil's doing, I was to betray the trust of that kindest man, just to get certain thing for a woman sent from the outer care." By that he means the communication with the courier from abroad. "That is why in this very petition I would like to request to be the sole sentence to all punishments. For even if I am to lose my life in this way, I would much rather do so than continue to live in wounded heart." So can you see, this is the man arrested for alleged espionage, who is openly saying, "Take only me, kill only me." This is the level of his moral compass in comparison to the guy who was murdering family members of other victims just to squeeze out the information out of them. Okay, so after a lengthy investigation, which was in which torture was used, and here there's an evidence of it because throughout the whole trial, Pilecki was keeping his hands behind him, and only to the horror of his wife, somewhere in the break between the trials, when he was marching along the corridor, she could see that his nails were torn off. After the investigation with torture, a show trial was organized, and it was spun in the way that he is the spy of General Anders. And why was it important? It was important because General Anders was a hero of the Battle of Monte Cassino. This was the decisive battle that was performed by the Poles in a strategic point of Italy, a location that was invincible according to the Germans, and many other armed forces sustained heavy losses when trying to force it, while the Poles succeeded. So in the Battle of Monte Cassino, they took over Monte Cassino and opened the access to farther parts of Italy and the West. And as a result, General Anders was a war hero in Poland, and he was potentially a person who could galvanize political opposition around him and to force for other solution than the ones arrived at Yalta. So he was extremely dangerous to the communist forces in Poland, and this is why Witold Pilecki was made to look as if he was organizing an espionage ring, which was invented by General Anders. And the trial was accompanied by a regular witch hunt in the Polish press. Pilecki was accused of espionage, of being interested in financial gains from espionage, of betrayal to the country, of all the worst crimes. And what was a very frequent practice in case of communist investigations, the main thesis that was presented at the trial was already there in the investigation. So he was not being investigated to find out what he did. He was being investigated to own up to what the investigators wanted him to own up to. And again, I'm going into detail here because I want to make it clear that the methods that he suffered from were equally ruthless to the methods that he suffered from in the Nazi camp. So there is a purposeful use of violence to achieve certain political aim. And in Kant, this was the subjugation of a certain group and removal of a certain group. And so it was in the communist prison. All the people that were involved in any form of opposition were to be annihilated. And here we have the last part. After the result of the trial was a sentence. And it was a group trial, so people got a number of sentences from shorter and more lengthy prison sentences to death. And in this trial, 3 people were sentenced to death. However, one of them was a young man, so his sentence was commuted to a life sentence. Another one was a woman, so because she was a woman, her that sentence was changed to a life sentence. But Pilecki was sentenced to death. And after he was sentenced to death, many people organized to beg for clemency for him. His official attorney made an appeal, trying to use to the benefit of Witold whatever good he did for the working class in the past, as well as his valiant card during the Second World War, but to no avail. And many people try to reach the authorities of Poland through private channels, also to no avail, which was surprising for many, because the prime minister at the time, Cyrankiewicz, was also a former Auschwitz inmate. So he must have known Pilecki, who in the camp was known as Tomasz Terafiński. What is, of course, extremely important here was that this part of Witold's story was completely left out from the trial. Nobody was allowed to use it as an argument to save his life, that this was the person who volunteered for Auschwitz to gather information about it. His past and whatever the achievements he has had for humanity, and however great, were not to be mentioned. Although in the documentation from this trial, there are 2 versions out of the 3 versions of the report, of Pilecki report that existed. Colonel Różański, who was the person responsible for the sentences in that trial, because he was the éminence grise after staying behind the sentences in that trial, which had preordained sentences, didn't allow for mentioning it at all. So the sentence for Witold was not only to be executed with his own clemency plea rejected and the clemency plea of his wife rejected, but also sentenced to oblivion. So in the communist Poland, he was virtually unknown. And again, this is very important to understand when we want to show how communism works, that not only individual opposition is persecuted and wiped out, but also the memory of this opposition is wiped out. Nobody knew who Pilecki was. What is more, his family was persecuted because they knew who he was. And his daughter was not allowed to finish her university education. Later on, she was persecuted, and it was impossible for her to find any reasonable job. So she had to work in an office next to a chemical plant in which conditions were so bad that she miscarried her baby. She was forced to carry heavy loads and sit in toxic fumes, and she lost the baby. So this is what communism did to the families of the heroes. Not only the individual punishment of death. His family didn't know whether Pilecki is alive or not. For many years, his wife believed he was sent to Siberia and was hoping he will come back one day. But also the persecution of the whole family. And of course, we still don't know where he was buried, because many efforts to uncover the graves of all those murdered in secrecy in Poland between 1947 and 1953 didn't give so many results. Some of them were found, but some were not, and Pilecki has not been found. So here I want to mention that his decision to go back to Poland and try to continue his intelligence work was not caused by some sort of fatigue, was not caused by the wish to continue his life as before the war and not starting anything new, because he had discussed with his wife whether she would like to leave or not. But his personal attitude towards many people with whom he worked as a soldier was that of a father, and this is mentioned by many of his comrades from the POW camp in Murnau, that he was very fatherly in his approach to the fellow soldiers. And in a discussion that he had with some people with whom he cooperated when forming this looser intelligence outfit after the Second World War, he mentioned not all of us can lead. Somebody has to stay here irrespective of the circumstances. So he, as a member of a certain elite of Polish nation, felt personally responsible for what is going to happen in Poland. And that's why I believe that it is so important to talk about Witold Pilecki and to make his life popularized in America, because it gives us insight into so many other problems related to communism, not only to active fight or the methods of subjugation or even the terror and targeting of the civilians that we also witness in Ukraine now. It is about the overall approach to all the spheres of life, because Pilecki was related to so many things. He was not only a soldier but also a society organizer. He was a brave man. He was a hero, but at the same time, it was not heroism understood as you know, the moment of emotion. It's a decision, a conscious decision of an adult and mature man who has his opinions about the world and about the aims of life to continue the struggle. And this is the only approach possible in the fight against communism, because what is happening in Poland now is that he has become a myth. The story of Pilecki entered the Polish popular culture and will forever remain there. And it would be my great desire that he also enters American popular culture, because I believe that Poles and Americans speak the language of freedom, and that both Poland and Americans believe in liberty and human rights and freedom to pursue their own dreams that defy any political system that tries to suppress them. So it is extremely important for the American audience to understand that there are more Americans than only Americans born in America, and that in every part of the world that is fighting for freedom, there are Americans like Captain Witold Pilecki. Thanks. Are there any questions? Yeah.
Why do you think Pilecki hasn't made it to sort of mainstream American World War II history discourse? I know obviously a lot of the Poland's efforts in World War II largely have been in American English that matter are sort of under the radar in the natural discourse. But why specifically American?
Why it is important for Witold Pilecki to enter the American public discourse is how I understand your question.
Yes, but also why is he not currently?
Oh, why is he not currently? Well, all those efforts take time. First of all, he was not widely known in Poland. So making him widely known in Poland was the first step to regaining the memory, because what is related to communism and what is very important is that communism is always working to destroy your identity, because your identity is supposed to be communist. So whatever identity you have before needs to be eradicated, and this is why people were being killed off like Pilecki. So the moment you have a post-Soviet country like Poland, you have to regain this group memory, so to say. And the group memory is formed by different experiences, also usually the tragic ones, because they are the most traumatic ones. But the people have to, the national heroes have to start to function in the group memory again. And of course, everybody can name a few American heroes, and the founding fathers, for that matter, are a part of your group identity as Americans. And Poland has to work on its founding fathers. And I believe that Pilecki has become one of the founding fathers of what it means to be Polish, but it took a while, also because in this first decade of post-communism in Poland, there was still a lot of tension between the old group of power holding power and the new group holding power to suppress certain information. So he entered popular culture in Poland, so to say, not instantly. And now I think it is a good moment to start to communicate it abroad. And to me, it's very important to try to escape this only the understanding of Pilecki as a hero related to the Holocaust, because of course he is the hero related to the Holocaust. He was one of the first people to realize what was going on and to inform the world that there's at all this idea of the annihilation camp of whatever nation, because first it was the annihilation camp designed to kill off the Poles. But yeah, he was informing the world about it, and it's very easy to fall into that, label of him fighting with the German atrocities. And I noticed this in many books that are available in English and devoted to him, that this is the sole focus, because it's the easiest focus, because it's obvious. What is not obvious is this whole cultural context of Pilecki being a hero because of who he was as a Pole, of the values to which he subscribed, of the history of Poland, of his youthful fight for the independence of Poland after the First World War. And we need to be able to communicate this broader context as Poles. It has to be articulated in Poland first. And to articulate it, there need to be an effort on the part of people who understand it may be of value also abroad, to present this broader image. And my monograph is an effort to introduce him, Pilecki, to the American imagination. And why is it happening only now? Because only now do we have this opportunity, because it already became a myth in Poland, and it would be good to try to so to say, spread the news. And that's why I think it took so long for him to reach America, so to say, in this particular anti-communist context as well. That it just had to first come into being in Poland, and now it has to be understood also here. And of course, this is partly, my research is partly scholarly, so it's by definition, it's going to be known to historians, but not so much to the popular culture. And I made an effort to escape, however, it was very difficult, this historionic, so to say, perspective, and try to prepare something for young audience. Because there are books about Pilecki, and my monograph is certainly not the most exhaustive of them. But what I wanted to prepare is a short book that tries to, nevertheless, place Pilecki in this social context of who he was, so that it is not an everyday man like you and me who out of the blue becomes a hero, because it's not true. To my mind, it's not true. And I wanted to make it popular and clear also for the young generation of Americans, because it is so important to understand that communism is not innocuous. Those ideas are not great ideas in theory, and only the practice fails from time to time, or actually every single time you try to implement them. But the communism and the communist ideology has a very precise mechanism of how it works. And this mechanism is delineated in my monograph because I resorted to some sociological research. And it clearly proves that communism was like Nazism in so many regards. It was it rejected codes that form the basis of relation between states, because what happened to Pilecki was that a Soviet imposed state administration was torturing him to death. So clearly the state borders are overridden by the administration of some country usurping the administration of another. Nazi power was not bound by any rules in relation to the people subject to it, so it was in case of communism. Adherents of the Nazi program of genocide erased and destroyed the traces of crimes they committed, thereby revealing an awareness of their activity. Well, so did the Soviets. Why do we still not know where Pilecki is buried? because they were covering their tracks. In occupied countries, Nazi activity was unequivocally perceived as criminal activity, contrary to moral law and to what is right. And this is so right, not only about communist Poland, but also about Ukraine. About Ukraine. Now, a part of this country is occupied by the Russians, and what we have access to, and we have access to so many pieces of information that people 50 years ago could possibly not know about communism. It's that their activity is criminal. And make no mistake, the Russia of today is the full inheritor of the ideas of the communist Russia. They have rehabilitated Stalin. They conduct their business the way they conducted it before. Namely, Russia is a state in which the Organization of Social Security is deciding about the shape of its foreign policy. Even what is happening now in Ukraine is called special military operation. Just like the operations performed by the NKVD against certain nations living in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, like Germans and the Poles. So there are so many similarities that people have to realize in America and not think communism is cool because it opposes Nazism. It says it opposes Nazism, but in fact, it is like it, which I think is the main highlight of my monograph, apart from Pilecki. In the minds of concentration camp prisoners, the system inflicted upon them was unequivocally perceived as an organized criminal system. And this is also very important in case of communist countries, that people feel oppressed. The societies of communist countries feel oppressed. You may think it's a great idea in theory, and so many people say they love communism. When you ask them, you go to American university students and they say, oh, it's a great idea. But when you go to an average inhabitant of a communist country, he's not very happy. He doesn't tell you he lives in heaven. You know, I will never forget a conversation I had with an American friend who said that it's great to go to Cuba because everything is so cheap. And he didn't mean only the food, but also booze and girls. So this is the American perspective on communism. Oh, it's cheap. The entertainment is cheap, but these are people. So yeah, I think that's why it's so important to advertise Pilecki, because it tells you about what communism is. And it's super important given what's happening in Europe now. Any other question? Yeah?
Yes, so talking about the investigation, sorry? Oh yeah, so talking about the investigation happened in 1947 related to, so we were talking about the Cardinal Różański, thank you, on his persecutions and sadistic methods of trying to hunt down movements, and also Ploszewski's criminal, also underground activity. Were those victims ever discovered of criminal events?
Undiscovered in what regard?
In regard to the murder conducted, while also
are you asking me whether he was punished for what he was doing?
punished, but also were the victims ever the remains of his victims or the family members ever found?
Oh, this is such a tricky question in Poland. Well, the reason why it's tricky is that officially, after the period of Stalinist terror finished in Poland, the people responsible for it were punished, quote unquote. So Colonel Różański was also officially punished. He spent a certain time in prison. I don't remember how long his sentence was, but it was by no means a prison sentence served in the conditions which he organized for his victims. because you know what you need to know, that the people subject to torture by Mr. Różalski, once he has finished the investigation, they were waiting for their sentence in horrible conditions. And for instance, you know, the cell had only a bed on which the mattresses on which the prisoners slept. The bed didn't serve to sleep on. It only served as a place to stack mattresses, which were normally spread on the ground, which is where the prisoners slept. And the other thing present in that cell was a water closet in which you were supposed to pee and poop, but also wash your clothes and take your water to drink from. So these were and of course it was not a big cell, so these were the conditions for the prisoners. Meanwhile, Colonel Różalski spent his prison sentence in comfortable conditions, and it was more of a bow to the requirements of the new political situation than a true recognition of whatever role he was performing. As to the victims, one of the features of the political transformation in Poland is that there was not so much reckoning with the previous system. And as one of the functionaries of the Polish former Polish Communist Party, who is still active in Polish political life, said to a former opposition member in Poland, when the opposition member said, "Oh, we battled communism in Poland," the response was, "No, you didn't battle us. You made a contract with us." And this is what happened. So no, there was no reckoning of all the victims of Colonel Różalski, because there was no reckoning whatsoever. Any other question?
Questions they can come up and ask.
Okay, so I think it's time to wrap up. So I just wanted to say thank you to the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, who made it possible for me to research Kapitan Pilecki and the Polish National Foundation, as well as to my husband, to whose great devotion I owe the fact that I can be here and talk, and he is in Poland with 3 little kids taking care of them. So thank you for this opportunity, and I hope that somebody makes a cartoon about Colonel Pilecki or makes a movie in Hollywood, and then he will be known all over the world because he deserves it. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to thank you, Maria, once again for this in-depth presentation and such a terrific analysis, especially relating to today's affairs and issues. And a quick thanks to VOC team, Pauline, Brittany, Ashley, Michael, and an awesome team of interns. Thank you for coming, and also for generous support of Polish National Foundation of this program and this event. And also I would like to invite everybody to visit our museum downstairs, our galleries. One of them has a panel on Witold Pilecki. You might enjoy kind of exploring this topic. And everybody already has a card that has a QR code that will lead you to Maria's report, to Maria's monograph, to original Pilecki's report, as well as the lesson plans that Maria designed. So please check in downstairs for the museum visit, and follow our website for more information, and of course our social media platforms for that as well. And I welcome you to for refreshments in the back. There's some printed monographs as well. And enjoy your day. Thank you.